Most people who carry debt into their 60s believe the problem is the debt itself. They think that if they could just eliminate what they owe, everything would settle into place. They would finally breathe. They would finally sleep. They would finally arrive at the financial peace they have been postponing for years. And so they spend enormous amounts of energy focused on the debt, the balance, the interest rate, the monthly payment, convinced that the debt is the disease and that paying it off is the cure. I spent the better part of my adult life working with people who carried real financial weight. I have sat across from men and women in their 60s and 70s who had done everything they were supposed to do, worked hard, raised families, built something, and who still found themselves looking at a list of debts that made them feel like they had failed. Like the decades of effort had produced the wrong result. Like something had gone quietly wrong somewhere, and they were not entirely sure when or how. My name is William Grant. I am going to tell you something today that took me a long time to understand, and that I wish someone had said to me plainly years before I finally worked it out myself. The debt is not the problem. The debt is a symptom. And if you spend the rest of your financial life treating the symptom without understanding what caused it, you will pay off one balance and accumulate another, reduce one burden and find a different one appearing somewhere else, over and over again, until the energy required to keep fighting exhausts you entirely. I know that sounds like the kind of thing someone says when they want to avoid giving you a real answer. So let me be specific about what I mean. When I was 62 years old, I sat in my office across from a woman named Margaret Holloway. She was 68. She had been a school teacher for 31 years. She had a pension. She owned her home, though there was still a second mortgage on it that she had taken out 12 years earlier to help her daughter through a difficult divorce. She had a credit card balance that had been sitting at roughly $14,000 for the better part of 5 years, never quite going down, never going dramatically up, just sitting there like a stone she had learned to carry. And she had a personal loan she had taken out 3 years prior to cover a medical expense that her insurance had partially rejected. Margaret was not irresponsible. She was not careless. She had not spent her life making foolish decisions, but she sat in front of me that afternoon with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a battle for a long time without being able to see clearly what they are fighting. She told me she woke up every morning thinking about the debt before she thought about anything else, that the first thing her mind did when she opened her eyes was calculate, that she had been calculating for so long she could no longer remember what it felt like to wake up and simply be present in a morning. I asked her one question. I asked her what she thought had created the debt in the first place. She gave me the answer most people give. She told me about the medical bill, about her daughter's situation, about a period years earlier when her income had temporarily dropped. She told me about the specific events, the specific moments when the debt had entered her life. And all of those things were true. All of those things had happened exactly as she described, but they were not the real answer. And sitting with her that afternoon, I began to understand something that I have since come to believe is the most important financial truth for anyone in their 60s who is carrying debt. The events that create debt are almost never the actual source of the problem. An unexpected medical expense is an event. A family crisis is an event. A period of reduced income is an event. These things happen to people. They happen to careful people. They happen to responsible people. They are not character flaws. But the reason those events result in long-term debt, in balances that stay and grow and refuse to resolve, is almost always something older than the events themselves. It is a gap, a structural gap between what comes in and what the life costs to run. That existed quietly for years before any crisis arrived to make it visible. Margaret's debt was not created by her daughter's divorce. Her daughter's divorce revealed a gap that had been there for a long time. The medical bill did not create her problem. The medical bill exposed it. And this distinction between what reveals a problem and what creates it is the entire difference between solving debt after 60 and simply rearranging it. Here is what that gap looks like in practice, because I want you to recognize it clearly. Most people in their 60s who carry debt have, at some point in the previous decade or two, been living at a standard that required their income to remain stable and predictable in order to sustain itself. Not an extravagant standard necessarily, simply the accumulated standard of a life built over time. The house, the car, the routine expenses, the small daily costs that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. That standard, maintained over years, has very little flexibility built into it, which means that when an event occurs, any event, any unexpected cost or drop in income, there is no margin to absorb it, and so debt appears. Not because of a moral failure, because of a structural one. And here is where everything gets more complicated after 60 specifically. Before 60, there is a reasonable argument that you can work your way out of that structure. You can increase income. You can take on extra work. You can hustle your way to a wider margin. The timeline is long enough that growth is a viable solution. But after 60, the timeline changes. The options change. And the strategy that might have worked at 40, earn more, grow out of it, is no longer the primary lever available to you. Which means that for anyone over 60 carrying debt, the solution is not the same solution that younger people use. It requires something different, something that most financial advice never gets around to saying clearly. The solution is not to pay off the debt faster. The solution is to redesign the structure that made the debt possible in the first place, while simultaneously building a plan to resolve what already exists. These are two parallel processes, and they must happen at the same time, because doing only one without the other produces only temporary relief. Let me tell you what happened with Margaret over the following 18 months, because I think it illustrates this more clearly than any abstract explanation could. The first thing we did was not look at her debts. The first thing we did was look at the full cost of her life as it was currently structured. Every fixed expense, every variable expense, every small recurring cost. And we looked at it without judgment. What we found was not shocking. It was simply honest. There were 3 areas where her monthly outflow exceeded what was genuinely sustainable given her pension income. Not dramatically, but consistently. And that consistent small excess, month after month, was what kept the debt from resolving, no matter how much effort she put into the monthly payment. Once we could see that clearly, we made 3 specific adjustments. Not dramatic ones. One of them was a subscription she had forgotten she was paying for. One of them was a pattern of weekly spending that she had not consciously noticed because each individual instance was small. And one of them was a refinancing of her existing loans that reduced her monthly obligation by enough to actually create breathing room. Not wealth, just room. A small margin where none had existed before. That margin changed everything, not because it was large, because it was real. Because for the first time in years, her income and her expenses were not in constant tension. And when that tension lifted, even slightly, her relationship with every other financial decision in her life began to change. She stopped making decisions from a place of scarcity and started making them from a place of small but genuine stability. And stability, even when it is modest, compounds. It builds on itself. It allows better decisions, which produce slightly better outcomes, which allow even better decisions. 14 months later, Margaret's credit card balance was gone. Not because she had suddenly found extra money, because the structure of her financial life had been redesigned well enough that the margin existed to actually move the needle. And because she was no longer waking up every morning calculating, she was waking up with enough clarity to make intentional choices rather than reactive ones. I think about Margaret often because her situation was not unusual. It was, in fact, one of the most common situations I encountered in all my years of this work. Decent people, careful people, people who had genuinely tried, carrying debt not because they were irresponsible, but because nobody had ever helped them see the structural gap underneath the visible symptoms. If you are over 60 and carrying debt right now, I want you to sit with one question after this video ends. Not, how do I pay this off faster? That is the wrong starting point. The question I want you to sit with is this: what is the actual monthly gap between what my life costs to run and what comes in reliably? Find that number. Find it honestly, because that number, not the balance on any individual account, is the real thing you are working with. And once you can see it clearly, the path forward becomes something you can actually walk. Debt after 60 is not a verdict on who you are or what you deserved. It is a signal. It is a structural signal that something in the design of your financial life needs to be adjusted. And the extraordinary thing, the thing I have seen proven over and over again across decades of this work, is that those adjustments are almost always smaller than people fear. The gap is almost always narrower than it appears from inside the anxiety it produces. You have carried this long enough, not because you were weak, because nobody gave you the right map. That is what I hope today has given you. Not a prescription, but a direction. A way of seeing the problem that makes the solution something you can actually reach. What I want to know from you, genuinely, is this: what would change in your daily life if debt were no longer the first thing your mind reached for every morning? Leave that in the comments. I read every one of them, and I think the answers might surprise you.